I'm Dan Graboy, and this is Life in Time of Pandemic. Today I am talking with Nick Cahill, who is an archaeologist. Hi, Nick.
Hi, good to
You're
talk with
sitting in your backyard, which is, as it turns out, right next to my backyard.
you.
And so we're neighbors, but we've never had a really in-depth conversation about what you do and how you're coping with the pandemic that's hitting us now. So first of all, just give us a basic idea of what you do.
Well, I'm a professor in the art history department at the University of Wisconsin, and I also direct an archaeological excavation in Turkey, which is called Sardis. It's the site of Sardis.
Sardis.
Sardis, Sardis. It's was one of the seven churches of Asia. It was the capital of the Lydian Empire in the time of Homer and Herodotus and those guys, ancient Greek times. And they invented money, they invented coinage. They were the richest people in the world at the time. They controlled all of Western Turkey. And then they weren't. So it's an interesting sort of opportunity to study some of the long processes in history, which is what really attracted me by the field of archaeology in general and the site in particular.
So before we talk about this site, and it sounds fascinating, is it normal for an archaeologist to be in an art history department? Is that a kind of a no-brainer, or is that a stretch, or how does that work?
America doesn't have archaeology departments, or it has one, maybe two, but mostly in America, archaeology is done through some other department, and it can be classics or history or art history or anthropology, of course. Lots of different departments. It's different in Europe. Europe has archaeology departments, but we just don't have that academic system. So
Do you know
I ended up
why?
in an art history department, and I've been very happy.
Do you know why we don't have archaeology? I mean, everybody's heard of archaeology and knows what it is, especially after Indiana Jones.
Yeah, I don't know. That's a really good question. There have been various attempts to make departments of archaeology. Archaeology got started in America rather later than in some other places. There wasn't really not many people were doing at least classical archaeology until the 1920s or so. And whereas in Europe it had a much earlier start. There may be something in that. And when I'm speaking of archaeology, I'm really thinking of classical archaeology, because the study of Native American cultures, the New World, has a long history, and they work within anthropology departments mostly. Anyway, it's a funny situation.
Well, let's get back to your site, Sardis. So you said it's in modern day Turkey?
Western Turkey, yeah, about an hour from the coast, an hour from Izmir.
Okay. And what is the time period in which it was inhabited?
It's famous for the people called the Lydians, who are these native Anatolian peoples who emerge kind of out of the shadows in the Iron Age, in the time of Homer and sort of the 8th century BC, 7th century BC, 6th century BC. They had their own writing system, but they don't use it until very late, and we don't have very many of their writings. And most of their writings that we have are things like tombstones, so they're not very interesting. So we know about them from outsiders, and that's always been, a challenge. So when I say that they emerge, what I mean really is that other people start writing about them at that time. And one of the fun things for us is to find out what is sort of really happening from the material culture rather than from other people's accounts. And and what we've just found, for instance, 2 years ago, we added another 1,000 years to that. We found that there were people doing big things at the site in about 2000 BC, which nobody had ever known. In fact, the ancient writers specifically say that they weren't doing this, and yet we have the evidence that they are. So go figure.
So that's 4,000 years ago.
4,000 years ago, yeah.
And what was happening at Sardis 4,000 years ago? Probably wasn't called Sardis at the time, or maybe we don't know.
We don't know. Sardis is one of the few places in the ancient world which has always had the same name. It's the modern village of Sart. It was Sardis in the Bible. It's Sardis in the Roman periods. Most ancient cities change their names fairly regularly, often because some king comes in and does something really great for them, and so they change their name to be Antioch after King Antiochus I, or Alexandria. Well, Alexandria was founded by Alexander, but lots of cities are named after kings. But Sardis never changed its name.
And do we know what Sardis means? Is there a meaning, an ancient meaning of that?
Oh, it's been related to the word for sun, but I'm not a linguist, and when people relate these words, when people make these claims, I'm never quite able to vouch for them sufficiently. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Okay.
Smart people can say interesting things. That doesn't necessarily make it right. And one thing I've found is you've got to be really, really skeptical about what people say.
Uh-huh. Always a good strategy.
Yeah.
So what kinds of things, to the best of your knowledge, were happening 4,000 years ago in this part of what is now Turkey?
Well, I could. It's a beautiful site on a mountain, on the slopes of a mountain, and one of the things that's most distinctive about the city is that they have to deal with this very steep topography, this very it's really irregular. It's almost uninhabitable in places. And so one of their strategies is to sort of regularize it by building these terraces, huge terraces involving, moving hundreds of thousands of cubic meters of dirt. And what we have from the early Bronze Age is the fill from one of these terraces. And that's all. And so far. And so what we know is that they're doing something then that's sort of similar to what they're doing later, which is terracing. And it must have been a really massive operation, because we've dug through 4 meters of fill before we reached bedrock. And there must be many, many more. I mean, it must have been a big operation. So that puts it in even though it's just dirt, and it's discouraging, it's really just dirt.
Well, anybody who's dug a hole in the backyard knows that just dirt, moving it is a lot of work.
And it means that they're moving these huge amounts of dirt. They're regularizing, they're taking an inhospitable landscape. The bedrock is like this at that point, and they're leveling it out, which is a big operation. So at that point, it's a big place, able to sort of glom onto a lot of manpower.
I suppose that implies a pretty strong hierarchical structure, social structure, lots of people cooperating or forced to cooperate, maybe.
Exactly. Yeah. Is what one would sort of infer from this dirt. Our problem at Sardis is that it was occupied not only 4,000 years ago, but then until 1500 AD or something, and it was a big city until 600. So in order to get to those early levels, you've got to go through the late Romans and then the early Romans and Hellenistic and Persian and Lydian and so forth. And so finding out these early levels involves a lot of years and years and years of work just in one spot. And so the area that we went down, you would be terrified by. It's like it's a telephone booth. It's sort of maybe 8 feet by 8 feet by the depth of a 5-story building.
So it's all scaffolded to get down, or laddered, or something like that?
You can put ladders down, but then there's no room to do anything because it's such a narrow space. So we lower people on ropes. There's a winch at the top.
Wow. So you really have to be an Indiana Jones level of courage to get down there.
You've got to be you've got to be willing to, it's not that it's risky because we have, knock on wood, never had an accident, and we're really careful about that kind of thing. But it means putting having a lot of trust in the people who are operating the winch.
Is it unusual that just sort of globally for the time period of 4,000 years ago that there would be such organization and such a massive coordinated effort of manpower to move Earth and
No,
also have such a plant? That's not
no,
unusual.
no, it's not. I mean, there have been cities at that point. There have been real cities for 1,000 years. We're talking about a period. This is after the pyramids, for instance. So people are already building things like pyramids in Egypt. But and even in Turkey, there's other sites that are, that are doing marvelous things, big walls and sculptures and, elaborate, burials with gold jewelry and amazing things. So it's not that this is unique in any way. It's just that this is the first time that we found it here.
And what's the most, if you can think of it, the most surprising thing you've found in your excavations?
Surprising. We always get surprises. We get surprise, and this is one of the things I love about it is that we're often finding, that everything we know is wrong, and you got to just keep a very, very open mind about it. This is the surprising part um, um, is learning how little we know in a way, and how much people make out of too little information, as I probably just did with this early Bronze Age fill. Maybe I'm totally wrong, but we found, let's see, one of the most dramatic things is sort of a general phenomenon in the middle of the 6th century BC. The king of Sardis was a guy named Croesus, as in rich
Rich
as
as.
that guy. And there's this famous story in Herodotus in which Croesus is worried about the rising power of the Persians off in the east, and so he attacks the king Cyrus, but is defeated instead. And Cyrus captures the city, and there's a wonderful story in which Cyrus is watching his soldiers loot the place, and um, um, Croesus says, what are they doing? And Cyrus says, they're looting your city. And Croesus says, not my city, it's your city. And Cyrus thinks about this and says, oh, you're right. But in fact, what we found was that we found lots of evidence for this destruction. And that's one of the things that archaeologists really love, is these massive destruction levels. Think of Pompeii. We know so much about Pompeii now because it was sort of violently destroyed, and then we left it, and then it's just left. And so you find all this stuff, and you find the bodies of people who have been killed, and you find weapons and armor, you find houses that have been burned with all their stuff in place. And so that's been, for me, one of the most exciting opportunities at Sardis, partly because it's just so interesting, and partly because it represents this, this amazing historical moment when the balance of world power shifted, and Sardis was the first city that Cyrus attacked when he became king. And by establishing his foothold there, he established the greatest empire that the world had ever known. That brings him into contact with the Greeks and with 300 and all that. So that's been really fun.
So that's the Lydian Empire? Is that what
That's
it's
the
called?
end of that's the end of the Lydian Empire and the beginning of the Achaemenid, or the Persian Empire.
Um, how did you discover this ancient city, or how did you get involved with doing research and running the site?
I came as a student. When I was, I don't know, 20 or something, when I was an undergraduate at the University of Michigan. And they needed a photographer that year. And I went as photographer and was given the opportunity also to excavate, and just loved it, and went back essentially every year since. So that was a long time ago.
Is that what convinced you to become an archaeologist?
No, I knew that I wanted to be an archaeologist. I was already working at a site in Israel, and I'd worked in Greece and England and some other places, but this was by far the most interesting and most exciting and rewarding place I'd ever been. So I've just been really lucky.
When I think of an ancient site, I think it makes me think life was exotic and different, and maybe people were different. But do you find when you're doing your work on this site that people are people, they haven't changed that much, and in spite of changing empires and stuff, it's still regular people, and we could maybe even fit in if we went back in time?
No, yeah, that's a good question. I mean, certainly in some senses, they ate, they drank, they lived in houses, they do all these sort of normal things. Um, they were soldiers, they got old and sick, they had diseases, and we've got these anthropologists who do these really interesting things with the skeletons we find. There are these, tragedies. We've got, the other year we got DNA evidence or DNA results from some of our skeletons, and there was a mother and child who were buried nearby one another, not together, but and you sort of think there are these each of them had these individual stories, and yet they're also, I think it's so easy to fall into the trap of thinking, oh yeah, nothing's changed, because things really do change, and people can be very different from one another. And I think the Lydians were very different um, from their neighbors. And one of the interesting things one of the things I've been really interested in is how you can sort of define cultural differences purely archaeologically. How people eat and drink is something that's very it's very culturally distinctive. And we don't eat, or many Americans at least don't eat snails, but there are people who do and value that kind of thing. And so to try to figure out what it is that's different about the Lydians in terms of their eating and drinking has been, something I've been particularly interested in. And that's an opportunity to use just sort of ordinary, see what ordinary Lydians are doing, and not worry about the big kings and emperors.
Do you find that as you think about those things, you sometimes back up and think in a more meta way about where it is we can look to find differences among people, and then bring that to your teaching?
Absolutely, yeah. That's something that's been really fun for me, and take you can sort of think of modern situations, which if you knew about them only from the point of view of archaeology, you might totally misinterpret them. And also, to take some of the sort of conclusions that archaeologists make and put them in a modern, or in a setting which you know more about, and see how they hold up. And I do like to have the students deal with those questions. And when I teach Roman, or when I teach anything, I often bring this site in just as something I know, and something where you can illustrate a point in a way that the students might not be familiar with. I mean, with material that the students might not be familiar with, but um, um, which can sort of bring it home in a very concrete way to them.
How many people on the team, how many people does it take to excavate? I mean, just, it sounds like you're moving dirt just like the ancients were moving dirt. And is there a lot of manpower there? Do you have a lot of students traveling there? How often do you go?
I go every summer. This is the first, if we don't go this summer, it's going to be the first time in 62 years that we haven't gone. I mean, not me personally, but we've been running every year since 1958. The excavation has, and nowadays we have 70 or 80 people on the staff, and that would include, archaeologists, conservators, architects, photographers, draftsmen, specialists in all kinds of different materials, people who do, pottery, or they do Hellenistic pottery, or they do Roman pottery, or they do cooking wares or something, or people who do scientific analysis, geophysical survey, and then and so forth. So it's a big team that way. And then we've got something like 70 or so men and women from the village that we live in, and from some of the surrounding villages, who do the actual labor, or do a lot of the labor. And and that's been really, really fun too. And these are people again, they're people who have worked for the dig for generations. People who I'm still working with, people who were there when I came first in 1979, and we've sort of grown up together and had kids. And I mean, they've had grandkids, and I haven't. But we've really grown up together, and that's been a lot of fun.
You have 4 kids.
Actually, 5.
5 kids. Okay.
Yeah.
I've only seen 4 of them myself.
Well, one of them lives in Australia.
Okay, that would explain that.
But she doesn't get back all that often.
Have you brought you must have brought your kids with you to,
Oh yeah.
have they helped out in the dig at all?
Yes. Abigail, number 2, one of the twins, came as an anthropologist for a couple of years, and they've all visited lots of times. Spent very varying amounts of time there. We spent a couple of years in Ankara on sabbaticals. And that's been really fun for them too, to see the country and get to know people and have that sort of, very different non-Western, non-American experience.
How is it different?
Living in Turkey?
Mm-hmm.
How is it different? That's a good question. It's a different atmosphere in a way. I mean, and I wouldn't want to make it seem too foreign, because one of the wonderful things is that it becomes a second home, and my kids have been very, very comfortable there. I love living in Turkey. I love the people. Everybody is incredibly friendly. It's, I remember when we first went, and Phoebe was who's our youngest, and she was 2, and you'd be walking down the street, and a 16-year-old boy would sort of look at her and say, "Oh, what a beautiful baby," and pick her up and hold her and stuff. And 16-year-old boys don't do that in America, and if they did, it would be a little weird. Or grandmothers would come along and like snatch this kid out of your hands and pat her cheek and stuff like that. And it's a very, very, very warm society, extremely hospitable, just a lovely place to work.
Does the whole family speak Turkish?
Everybody speaks some more than others. Phoebe went to school there when she was, sort of just learning to talk. And so she came out with babbling in perfect Turkish inflection. She got the sounds, which, an American probably can never actually get completely correct. And she got the sounds perfectly. She probably didn't learn a great deal of Turkish. She understood everything. But yeah, Fiona the oldest went to college in Turkey for a year. Did a study abroad program. She was scheduled to go to Egypt. She was studying Arabic, and that was the spring of Arab Spring, another sort of disruptive event. And so she didn't get to go there, and was rescheduled to go to university in Istanbul, and loved it. And that was a much more familiar setting for her.
Before we talk about our own disruptive event, does the dig at Sardis have a website where people can see some pictures and get some information?
It does. It's called sardisexpedition.org. And one of the things that I'm doing during this disruption is sort of working through some, making a lot of additions to it, taking stuff that I've always wanted to make more public and bringing it out on that website. I've been working on YouTube videos, actually, of drone footage. And one of the things that's been, for me, most rewarding, most enjoyable, and really giving new insights, is, in addition to being fun and beautiful, is flying a drone over the site. Because The topography is so remarkable and so dramatic and so beautiful that you don't get a real sense of it from the ground. And the previous director, I remember, always had an item in the budget for the helicopter project, that he knew an Army colonel who could get him onto an Air Force helicopter or something. And so in order to rent this, there was always some money in the budget in case it came off, and it never did. And now for nothing, you can buy a professional drone. I mean, not nothing, but for relatively little, and get these amazing views. So I've been bringing those out and sort of trying to write short explanations of what you're seeing and how what we've learned helps you understand how, what you learned from archaeology helps you understand the natural landscape and the state of the landscape today. And it's also just fun.
So I will put links to some of these videos and to the website in the comments down below after we're done, after I post it. I should have mentioned, if I didn't, that it is May 20th that we're speaking, and obviously our weather has gotten nice and we're able to escape from the prisons of our houses. We've been shut down for over 2 months now, and we're very grateful for the nice weather. I assume that the dig has stopped on site, but maybe not. Are there still local people working in Sardis?
The work only goes on during the summer when we're present. So during the winter, it's there are guards, and it's open to the public. But the archaeological work, the archaeological excavation, only takes place during the summer.
So you do your on-site research during the summer, and then when you're here, obviously you're teaching, but are you also kind of putting together your interpretive ideas, maybe writing? Do you publish articles in journals or?
Articles, books. We're printing a book as we speak in Istanbul, a book that we've worked on for 40 years now. And then we've got another one coming down the pipes after that. So we're actually as busy as ever.
Do you work in the realm of interpreting your results for everyday people, or are you very much writing as a specialist to other specialists when you're writing about Sardis?
You have to do both. And obviously, you don't get in the academic world, you have to do the specialist interpretation and the scholarly articles, but I think it's also very important to make it accessible to the general public. And that's been one of the reasons why I've wanted to put everything on the website, put as much as I can on the website and keep that accessible to people. It is, as much as I can, it's bilingual in English and Turkish. And we'll be doing more of that in the this summer.
Have you written a book about the site for the layman that people could either find in a library or buy?
We've written a couple of things. Unfortunately, the book that we did about 10 years ago about Sardis and the Lydian period was printed in not unfortunately, it was printed in Turkey, and it was an exhibition catalog. But they very nicely, it's a private museum in Istanbul, and they very nicely gave me permission to use all the essays and all the photographs that they took of this and more. So all that is on the website, so you don't have to buy the book. You can just read the website and you've got the book. Okay. And all of our scholarly books are also just available for download for free.
Great. So people who are interested in pursuing this will have plenty of information in the comments.
More than they would want.
Okay. Well, maybe they want a lot. It sounds fascinating. Would you describe an archaeologist as just a storyteller about ancient sites?
Stories are so important, aren't they? And they're the only way that you can really get a grip on the sort of masses of just random information that we pick up. And most of what we pick up is, especially in archaeology, is random and a lot of it meaningless. Or at least its meaning is not obvious to me. So then making the story out of it is one of the most interesting aspects of it. And we really, as you know, yeah, and yes, that's the process. It's finding. I mean, and it's a very recursive one, isn't it? So you figure out what you want to know. You figure out a way to learn something more about it, and often that involves digging a hole in the ground in a particular place. And then you either find something you didn't expect, which is usually what happens, or you find, or whatever you find, then you have to sort of make sense of it. And an awful lot of the time, the sense that you make of it is not what you were expecting. So for instance, just for instance, I mentioned that the Lydians invent coinage, and the earliest coins in the world were made at Sardis, and we were lucky enough to find two of them of 12 years ago or something. And they're made of this material called electrum, which is a mixture of gold and silver. And since the 19th century, everybody's been saying that in antiquity, Sardis was famous as being rich in gold. They had more gold than anybody else, and because there's a river that runs by the city called the Pactolus River, which flowed with gold, and you imagine sort of the California gold rush and all that. And so the idea has always been that they invent coins because they've got all this gold available, right? And that's what they make it out of. And but the earliest coins are not made from pure gold; they're made from electrum, which is this alloy of gold and silver. And so what numismatists have said since the 19th century is that this is a naturally occurring alloy that is what you pan out of this river, as so often in naturally occurring gold, that most gold is mixed with some proportion of silver, or a great deal of it is mixed with some proportion of silver. So when we found these coins a couple years ago, I was sort of asked, what more can I learn from these that isn't already known? And one thing I became interested in is their composition, and in particular how the coin was treated in minting, and that's sort of a different story. But in the process of this, I thought this would be an opportunity, and since we were doing analysis of gold coins anyway, I thought I could get some. If only I could get some gold from the Pactolus River and see what the natural proportion of gold to silver was in the Pactolus, then we could tell how much it's been diluted or messed with in order to mint these coins. So we'd actually panned a couple of flecks of gold from the Pactolus River back in the day, and a local geologist gave me a few more gave me little vials of the stuff from nearby streams also, and so I took it to Izmir, to a lab at the university there, and they said, no, it's not electrum. It's pure gold. It's 100% or 99 point something percent pure gold, which came as a total surprise to me, and shouldn't, because actually the geologists, if you go back through the early geological literature, they failed in finding silver, but no archaeologists really paid attention to that, because we knew, because of the coins, that they were. So that sort of put a different spin on this whole question of where do coins come from, and how come the Lydians invent coinage, and where does the gold come from? Because if it's coming from the Pactolus, there's no reason to mix it with silver. So my sort of conclusion was that that this has to do with imperialism, and that the Lydians, one of the early things that they do is they go off and they conquer northwest Turkey, which is where the ancient and modern gold mines are, and that the gold in the river gives them the sort of jump starts their conquest, allows them to go and search out more gold, and that's where the gold is in fact mixed with silver. The gold from northwest Turkey is different from the gold at Sardis itself. And the story that, so you're left with these, what you've got is, you asked about stories, and the, what you end up with is like scientific analyses of little flecks of junk, not junk, gold, but um, but how you make that into a story that makes sense historically and is really complicated and really interesting, and for me at least, um, and and the story that I sort of envision here, although it may be completely wrong, is that the Lydians, then they do conquer northwestern Turkey, and they do come into possession of these gold mines. And we've got lots of references to the Lydians controlling the gold mines of northwestern Turkey. But I imagine them thinking, getting there and finding this gold, which now is not pure, and they could. That's all the technology of measuring the quality of gold goes way back. It's 1,000 years earlier in Mesopotamia. So they were able to tell whether it was pure or not, and they were able to do something about it. They were able to refine it. They were able to separate gold and silver and so forth. But they chose not to, in an interesting way. They chose instead to invent this new way. They've got this sort of useless stuff, which is not good as gold. It doesn't fall into the standard existing system of exchange, because at that time, people used silver and gold as weighed sort of little clumps, little nuggets. And you could tell how much it was worth because you could weigh it. And that's how much it's worth. And that works really well for pure gold, and it works really well for pure silver. But for this mixture of gold and silver, whose quality depends on not just its weight, but its composition, it doesn't work anymore. And so the Lydians have to then invent this new technology to take advantage of this junk that they now, of this stuff that they own, which is valuable and yet doesn't fit the existing economic systems. And so they have to invent a new economic system, which we still live with.
And they literally monetized that product.
They literally monetized that product. They invented this new way of dealing with this valuable material, which we still use.
How do you feel about movies like Gladiator and Troy that represent the past undoubtedly with fantasy and filled with errors, historical errors?
Love them. I have no problem with historical fiction, and they can be very, very well done. They can be very moving. They can get people involved, and they can be very enjoyable. I mean, Gladiator, Troy was. I mean, I just had a great time watching Brad Pitt, and even though it's historically completely wrong and misleading, and you can make all kinds of complaints about it, but it's enjoyable, and you can't take your scientific work all that seriously.
Did you find that you were able to teach to your level of expectation when we became remote and we're teaching over video conferencing? Or is that not so bad because you can lecture and show slides, or do you prefer teaching in a kind of a seminar context, which is hampered by video conferencing technology, or how'd you do with that?
Well, it was tough because a lot of this, you can't, in the system that we were using, at least, it wouldn't work if everybody turned their cameras on. And we just couldn't handle the bandwidth, and my house couldn't handle the bandwidth. And so, and I think the students, I felt like my students at least, were a little uncomfortable turning their cameras on. And so that was you felt very distant. And it was hard to gauge how interested people were. Attendance was very good. People got up at 8:50 in the morning and came to class to learn on Roman archaeology for whatever reason. But I was happy about that. And I think they said, when I asked them, they said that they liked the rhythm, they liked the schedule, they liked having that part of their life continue, and not having not just watching a video of a talking head that somebody's reported at their leisure. So that was, that was better than it might have been, but it was still very, very difficult to, a little hard to ask questions. A lot of it was done by typing in the comments box, which is a little odd.
One final question.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think in 4,000 years, archaeologists will find evidence of the current worldwide pandemic?
Ooh, that's a good question.
What do you think they might find?
Presumably a lot of, historical records will survive, more historical records will survive for them than we have for pandemics in the past. But those things can be difficult to see in the archaeological record. I mean, you can do, of course, there will be many more deaths, and people in the future, I'm sure, will be doing, the kind of DNA analysis that we do now of people who died from plagues. And one of the things I found a little bit difficult this semester was talking about the plagues that afflicted the late Roman Empire, the Antonine plague and the Justinianic plague that took out, some undetermined but very large proportion of Europe. And are all too topical in a way. And I wasn't sure how much the students wanted to hear about, the Justinianic plague, which recurred year after year after year after year for something like 200 years.
That's a depressing piece of news right there.
That is a depressing piece of news right there, exactly. And it mutated. It's a different bug, of course, but it mutated so that, people who survived the first wave would not survive the next one. As I understand it, I'm not an expert on these things, but there has been really interesting work done on the, identifying the specific strains of this plague that killed so many people in, they've got victims in England and Germany and throughout Europe. So,
well, on that cheerful note, at least we have the beautiful image of your backyard, and we can be outside, still being careful, of course.
And still be socially distant, exactly.
Exactly.
It's
and
a little weird to be talking with you next door.
Yes, if you just tip your camera, people can see that my house is literally right there, and that's where I am. So it's
wave out the window.
It's wonderful to talk to you, and you're in your tree house, which is great. And thanks so much for speaking with me.
Well, thank you.